He was the co-host, co-presenter with Graham Sade at the time doing the nutrition farming courses. And we've been in contact since and seen each other several times over the last decade. And wanted to get him back. He was here 45 years ago at the No-Till on the Plains, and wanted to get him back out here. When we get done today, you'll realize why I wanted to get him done. I'm not gonna say too much because he's already got a pretty big head, but he's probably one of the best teachers you will find in ag in the U.S. And I'm not exaggerating that. You'll see today. And he explains it in a way that's easy to understand, easy to grasp for everyone. So I will give Joe the floor and let him start, but just want to welcome him here and thank you all for showing up today.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. And yeah, great to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming along. So we've got a pretty jam-packed day today, but I think we'll keep the agenda a little bit flexible as we go along. Yeah, you'll have, yeah, okay, if you want to tweak it, you can. Yeah, real pleasure to be back in this part of the world. We've got a lot to get through, but I think we'll keep the agenda a little flexible, and I'm happy to kind of take questions as we go along, but I think we'll definitely have maybe some set time at the end of each presentation for some questions. But if there's anything particular that you want to kind of interrupt me with, I'm absolutely fine with that. You know, something that's kind of very relevant to the slide, or a clarification on anything on the slide that's kind of topical and relevant at that time, feel free to interrupt. We can have kind of just break things up a little bit as we go along, but otherwise we'll have some time for discussion, I'm sure, in blocks after. And I'll say a few quick words about myself for those that you're not familiar with me, and then we'll dive into it. So I am, as you can hear, I have a bit of a funny accent, although it might be you guys that have the funny accent. So I'm originally from Australia, and there I studied agriculture, and I've been interested in soils for a long time, back about 20 odd years ago when they weren't quite so in vogue. I used to tell people I was studying soils and working in soils, and I would get the raised eyebrow, like, soils? I'd get these kind of weird looks. 20 odd years later, it's, as you all know, it's, we can't go anywhere these days without hearing about soil health. So yeah, I've always been interested in soils. I have a background in soil chemistry, fertilizer side of things, nutrient, mineral balancing, plant nutrition, foliar feeding. It's going to be a big part of today's topics. So I kind of did a lot of that kind of work in Australia, with a range. Australia's a big country, obviously, like you guys. We have lots of different crops. I did a bit more in horticulture back then, and kind of moved more into cash crops and row crops since then. But that was a bit of my background. After that, I moved to the UK. I also have my father's from Wales, so I have a British side, and I lived there for about 10 years, and that's where I started working a lot more with cereals and row crops and things, and started working a lot more with the soil biology side there. I was doing composting, compost extracts, soil food web type concepts, so it was kind of got into that half. And really, kind of these days, that's kind of where I try to find this balance between these two. How do we integrate our fertility requirements, the nutritional requirements, with kind of this optimizing soil health, soil biology, working with biological inoculants, these types of things. So I try to kind of meet in the middle of these two worlds these days, and that's kind of what I bring in my educational work. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I've moved back and forth between Australia and the UK for a couple of years there. I went back to Australia and realized I wanted to be back in the UK, so I went back there, and I've worked on some farms in both these two countries. I've done a bit of market gardening and kind of consumer focused stuff. I worked on a cool project in London, on a university, engaging kind of young adults, students, about food and where it comes from, and doing some food growing and that kind of thing. So kind of done a range of different things. Through all of those different things, I've kind of always had a bit of an educational side, giving presentations, doing this kind of work. About 6 years ago, I moved to Canada, so I'm based there now. And that was when I kind of dropped everything else in my career and just started doing this. So I'm an independent educator. I don't sell products. I just give information. And, I work with companies who sell products. They kind of book me to give speeches and talks. They do their product promotion. I just kind of deliver the information. So I'm independent in that regard. I primarily do education. I do a little bit of consulting work with farmers in, again, mainly kind of UK and Australia, but I do quite a lot of work over in Europe generally. I seem to be busy over there a lot, it seems. So I'm very fortunate enough to travel internationally and do this. So I get to meet a lot of wonderful people like yourselves. And look, I'll be honest, I consider myself still and forever a student of the soil. I hate this word, soil expert. I don't consider myself an expert at all. Once you're an expert, then you know it all. And I certainly do not know it all about soils. There is so much. I think that classic quote that I'm sure you've all heard, that, the more and more you learn, the less and less you realize you know. I think that soil is probably the best example of that kind of quote. There we go. Good timing. Good reminder for everyone. Good time of the day. Please check your phones. So I'm passionate about soils. I still read so much about them. I'm still learning, and I learn from you guys. I'm going to bring a lot of information today. I try to bring science and practice together. I'm going to share a lot of science and studies with you. As Nick said, I do explain them in a way that I'm sure you're going to keep with me and understand. I don't get into the nitty-gritty complexities of it. I like to share it with you so that you know it's there. There is a lot of good science out there about some of these ideas, and I'm going to try and bring that to you. But I learn from you too. I'm going to give you some advice, some guidelines, some big picture. But there are specifics here in Kansas that I don't know about. I don't live here. I don't know your local context exactly. So I'm going to give some generalized information. But if you guys are doing something different than what I say, or if you've got something to feed into that or pitch into that, feel free, chime in. I'm happy to have a bit of a discussion about that, and hear what you're doing specifically in this context, because there are many different contexts, and I have a good grasp of a lot of them, but there's always a lot of specifics underneath that. So I'm happy to hear what you are finding is working here for you in this context too. So I do learn from you too. Happy to have a two-way interaction. I've just come from Washington State. I was doing an event up there before coming down here. So it's been nice to be back in the US. I haven't been here for quite a few. Actually, this is the first time I've been back to the US since before COVID. So nice to be back here again, and coming back again in a few weeks' time for the Montana Soil Health Conference. So I've got a couple of things here before I head to Australia for the rest. I'll be escaping the rest of the winter. I'm heading there for about 7 weeks on a big tour until April. So we were having a laugh up in Washington. Some of my pronunciations is a little funny. I say things like compost instead of compost, or process. I say process. You guys say fertilizer. I say fertilizer. But we don't use so many Zs as you guys. Do you say Z or Z? What do you say here? Z? Okay. We don't use quite so many Zs as you guys do. But anyway, and I'm sorry, I'm a liters per hectare and a kgs per hectare kind of guy. I still struggle a little bit with your gallons, and but I've done some conversions of my slides. I've made an effort to find all my S's and change them to Z's and Z's, and I updated some of my into gallons per acre. So I hope I've got them all correct. I don't mind admitting, something about your system I find very confusing. So I'm a very much metric kind of guy. But so we'll get there. You can help me on some of those things. So okay, let's dive into it. That's it. We're going to start this morning with a bit on plant nutrition generally, and we'll kind of steer that into some foliar feeding discussion. That's going to be a bit of plant nutrition across the whole, but we're going to give it quite a focus on nitrogen. But we'll kind of cover a few other nutrients that kind of link into that. Then after the break, we'll do a little bit on kind of pest and disease management, how we can grow our plants more resistant to pest and disease. So just this idea of plant health. How do we kind of design with a bit more diversity? how do we use biologicals, how do we use, again, nutrition with a specific focus to optimize plant health against pest and disease. So that's going to be quite a lengthy one in the middle. We'll break somewhere in the middle of that for lunch and come back and finish it off. And then at the end, I'm kind of doing it a little bit backwards this time, just for something different. We're going to do, I know that after the post-lunch lecture is always a tricky one. So I've actually tried to put the more detailed and complex stuff up front when you're all freshly loaded with caffeine and nice and alert. And then I've actually kind of put the more, what I would normally do first, a bit more of the introductory presentation on kind of soil health, the bigger picture stuff that we kind of paint that scene, and then I drill down into the details. But I'm actually going to put that after lunch. Or at the last presentation at the end of the day, just to keep it a bit lighter. So we'll see how that works for today. So yeah, that's kind of where we're going to go. And if I can just ask you a quick question or two, just show of hands, just so I get a feel for who's in the room here. So is anybody here just livestock, purely cattle or grazing, or so we've got a couple. Okay, is anybody then mixed livestock and cropping of some kinds? Looks like quite a few. And then how many are just cropping and cash crops and that kind of thing? All right. Is there anyone like horticulture or anything kind of like that here, or anything else? Maybe is there a few advisors? We might have a few advisors in here. Yeah. Okay. Or like environmental, water type people, anything like that? Okay, a couple. Yeah. Anyone growing bananas? Oh no, that's Australia. So. Yes. Okay, all right, good. So we've got quite a mix. It's a small handful of pure livestock people, and then we've got mostly a mix of cropping and livestock and cropping. So that's good. Okay, so let's dive into it. So in terms of plant nutrition and plant growth, of course, we start with photosynthesis, and everything really starts with the sun. It's that warmth, the temperature, it's that energy that the sun provides that the plants, of course, tap into and make use of that energy in order to photosynthesize. So this is where it all starts. We're lucky we have that hot thing up in the sky that enables life on Earth to thrive. So we need that energy, the sun, but then, of course, we need air. And particularly, I'm talking about the carbon dioxide, of course. This is the carbon. It's the element of life. It's the stuff of life. We need that carbon dioxide, so we need air as the other kind of key ingredient to start this discussion. Of course, we also need water, and the plants will take that up from the soil, of course. And now we've got these key ingredients. We've got carbon and oxygen from that CO2, and now we've got hydrogen and oxygen. So we've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and these are the three kind of key ingredients that we need for that photosynthesis. This is the bulk of what plants are made up of. These are the elements of life, carbon and water, and we kind of bring those together in order to grow plants. But beyond that, plants also need nutrients, macro and micro essential nutrients that kind of come from the geology, come from the rock that weathers, and as we form soil, we have all of the minerals, the essential nutrients. And those nutrients are also required to drive that photosynthetic process. It's not just plants magically breathing in carbon dioxide and turning that into their bodies and their biomass. We have to have the mineral catalysts, the nutrients that facilitate this process. So this is photosynthesis. This is my complex diagram. This is the deep science that I was talking about with you all earlier. This is essentially what it is. It's that sun, it's the energy, the air, the carbon dioxide, the water, with minerals, and I use the ice cream emoji to depict this one. Of course, this is, you guys are farmers, you can handle manure, you're cool with manure. So I use that to represent the soil, the nutrients. So we need those nutrients, those catalysts, and that's what really then helps to drive this process towards biomass production. So that's it in a nutshell, photosynthesis. That's what we're trying to optimize. This is why we have this discussion about using that sun's energy, this whole keeping the soil covered, extending the season, cover crops, keeping that soil covered so that we can capture as much sunlight energy and drive that turn that into carbon, into fuel, into energy, food for the system. It's all about bringing more carbon into the soil that helps to then drive a lot of the processes, the soil health processes that we talk about. So this is also photosynthesis. We take that simple slide before and just layer a little bit more detail on there, but I'm just saying the exact same thing. And it's about that carbon dioxide with water, but it's here. It's those essential nutrients, and they act as part of enzymes. An enzyme is just a catalyst. So it's just catalyzing, it's just facilitating this reaction, helping it happen, helping it function. And then we produce this here, the sugar, the glucose. This is the product of photosynthesis, plus, of course, some leftover oxygen for us to breathe. So once we have that sugar molecule there, that glucose molecule, this is primary photosynthesis. This is that first step. Now we have this building block. We have carbon that has been turned from gaseous carbon, from thin air. Now we have some chemical energy. We have it into some biomass that the plants are made up of. So once we have that first sugar, this is the building block. This is primary photosynthesis. Then from that building block, then the plant turns that sugar and carbon from that sugar into all sorts of other things. Everything, anything and everything that the plant is made up of, that it requires, be that structurally, its body, lignin, cellulose, these types of things, or metabolically, so certain kind of compounds that it requires internally in the sap that perform particular functions. Everything that the plant is made up of, it really comes from this building block, the sugar. And with that sugar, the plant can build all sorts of things. It can just stitch those sugars together to make complex sugars, long-chain sugars, carbohydrates. It can kind of plug in some nitrogen or sulfur into there, building amino acids and stitch them together to build proteins. We're all interested in building protein for quality, of course. So we need the carbon from photosynthesis as well as some nitrogen and sulfur plugged in there to build those proteins. But also, again, everything else. The plant needs to build its cuticle, so waxy compounds, fats and oils, various waxy type materials. These also come from that carbon, from the building block. And then other things, vitamins, plant growth hormones, hormones that it requires for growth processes. Smelly compounds, so the aromatics, the volatile organic compounds. These are the smells and the scents that we smell when we smell flowers, or we walk into a crop and we can smell those leaves. All of those volatile things also. And then defense chemicals, and this will be the theme for the second presentation. We'll dive deep into some of the defense chemicals and the protective compounds, the immune enhancing compounds that the plant can produce to help protect itself against pests and disease. And then root exudate. Some of that photosynthetic carbon is also sent down, of course, to the roots to grow root biomass, and some of that is leaked or excreting out of those roots as root exudates, that liquid carbon to feed the soil biology and drive many of those soil health processes. But again, in order for the plant to do all of this second step, this is what's called secondary metabolism, again, we require essential macro and micronutrients that are part of enzymes or catalysts that make this happen. And if you have a deficiency of any one, or an imbalance or a limitation of any one of those nutrients, essential nutrients, in the yellow writing there, if you have a limitation, this process is not going to function optimally. And if there's some key nutrients we need for primary photosynthesis, that's what I'm going to talk about now. And if you don't have enough of those, this isn't going to function. You're not going to you're not going to have much good sugars. You're not going to have much of the building block. And or it could be that you've got enough for primary photosynthesis, but maybe you don't have some of the other nutrients that are then required for this second step. And so maybe you can have a lot of simple sugars in the system, but you're not turning them into more complex things, which are also very, very important. They bring a lot of different functionality. So if you have, key point there, as you can appreciate, it's not just about having mineral deficiencies that limit production and growth in that sense, although that's a big part of it. It can also limit all sorts of other important functions or plant health outcomes as well. And that's what we're going to really unpack. So this is the essence of the discussion today. This is why we want to optimize plant nutrition, so that we optimize both of these primary and secondary processes. So photosynthesis happens in the chlorophyll, and this is the site of photosynthesis. And chlorophyll is made up of magnesium and nitrogen and a bunch of other carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen attached around the edge. So if we don't have enough magnesium and nitrogen, we can't build this molecule. And if you can't build chlorophyll, then you have limited sites for this photosynthesis. It's chlorophyll is the magic compound that absorbs that sun's energy, where we can then fix that carbon dioxide into that chemical energy, into the sugar. So magnesium is foundational. Nitrogen, of course, is also foundational. Now, on top of that, we also need iron. Iron is required to build this molecule, to synthesize this molecule. It's not part of the molecule, but it is part of the synthesis. So iron becomes another important one. And as you all know, when we have iron deficient plants, they often look very yellow, very white, that chlorosis. And that's why, because we have a chlorophyll deficiency. And that's that negative of the iron. So magnesium is that first one. Beyond chlorophyll, magnesium is also really important for lots of other things, particularly protein synthesis, protein nitrogen utilization. And we're going to dive deep into this one. So a lot of the magnesium is also very tightly coupled with nitrogen utilization. But sure, some of it is really important for that chlorophyll synthesis. Iron, as I mentioned just then, but iron is also important. We're not going to talk too much about nitrogen fixation today. I'm going to do just one tiny comment on it, but iron, along with molybdenum, is really important for the bacteria in the soil in order for them to fix nitrogen from the air. They build this special enzyme called nitrogenase, and that's the magic enzyme that can grab onto nitrogen gas and turn it into a form that plants can use. So both molybdenum and iron are really important for that, beyond its role in photosynthesis. We're going to talk about the nitrate reductase enzyme as well. Iron also plays a role, nitrite reductase enzyme. We're going to dive into this one. Iron also plays an important role in nitrogen utilization. Okay, then manganese. Some of you might have heard this discussion before. Manganese is really important to split that water molecule. When we talk about photosynthesis, H2O, we need to separate out that hydrogen and that oxygen. And that's the role of manganese. It helps to split those so that we can use that H2O and re-stitch it together with the CO2 to form that CHO, that sugar that we were talking about earlier. So manganese also very, very important for this primary photosynthesis. But then it does all sorts of other things, of course, as well. Really important for seed quality, germination. Really important as a disease-fighting nutrient. We'll expand on this one. Manganese is very important for plant resistance against pest and disease. It helps with building kind of physical barriers, but also helping the plant to synthesize internal defense chemicals as well. So it's a very strong link with plant health, and we're going to expand on that one. So we've got magnesium, we've got nitrogen, we've got iron for chlorophyll synthesis, we've got manganese for water splitting, and then the last one we key need for photosynthesis is phosphorus for energy. Photosynthesis is an energy-intensive process. We, of course, get a lot of that from the sun, but the plant also needs some energy there to build those enzymes to make this happen. So phosphorus is the kind of the final key nutrient that we also require for photosynthesis. So at a foundational basic level, these are the kind of the 5 key things that we absolutely have to focus on initially. And then beyond that, once we kind of optimize those key nutrients for photosynthesis, after that, we have to optimize everything else. All of those other nutrients for that second step, for the secondary metabolism. And that's where all of the plant nutrients become important. All of the macros, yes, nitrogen's really important for yield, of course it is, but it does other things like build protein quality, which we're going to talk in detail. Phosphorus, of course, I mentioned energy already, but root development, as you all know, really important, starter nutrient to help those roots establish. Potassium, it does lots and lots of things in the plant, but particularly very important in the latter stages of plant growth, reproductive stages for grain fill, fruit fill, sizing up seed, carrying sugars, carbohydrates, nutrients to the seed, so sizing those up. Calcium also, we're going to talk that when we talk plant health and disease resistance. Calcium deposits in the cell wall, so it kind of makes the plant cell walls much more structurally rigid, makes it tougher for pathogens to penetrate through. So calcium, it works along with silicon to do that. Now, technically, silicon is not an essential nutrient, but I squeeze it on this list. It's a very, very beneficial nutrient. And I think that if anyone's interested in reducing their inputs, particularly on the pesticide inputs front, if you're looking at reducing those inputs and the economic benefits that can come with those reductions, some of the chemicals are getting more and more expensive, as I'm sure you know. There are certain nutrients that we can optimize in the plant, which makes it less attractive to pest and disease. And calcium and silicon and boron, all three of these work really closely together. They deposit in the cell walls, making it harder for pest and disease to penetrate. So I would argue, if you're interested in reducing some of those inputs, that silicon is an essential nutrient to help with that goal. So that would be another one. Mag, chlorophyll we mentioned, and nitrogen utilization. Sulfur as well, also really important with nitrogen utilization. Sulfur, some of the amino acids are sulfur bearing, cysteine and methionine. So sulfur is important for those amino acids. So there are many sulfur related proteins that the plant also needs the plant uses as well. And then the trace minerals. So boron, also really important for sugar movement around the plant, translocation. So those photosynthetic products that are made in the chlorophyll, boron has a role to move them around throughout the rest of the plant, down to the roots, etc. So boron is quite important early on for good root establishment, like phosphorus. Boron and phosphorus work well together here to encourage early rooting. But then afterwards, boron is really, really important for flowering. Anything to do with flowering, pollen production, pollination, all of that kind of reproductive phase, boron is really, really key for at that time. Copper, also very important for lignin synthesis, so good plant stem strength, preventing kind of lodging and things, but also it helps with disease resistance as well. Zinc has a link with the leaf size. It has a tight relationship with auxin production, and auxins, that hormone governs leaf size. And of course, the leaf size, that's your solar panel. So the bigger your solar panel, the more of that sunlight energy you're going to capture and be able to turn that into photosynthetic products. So zinc and leaf size is really important. Manganese we also touched on. As I mentioned, it's very important for splitting water, but also for reproductive processes, seed maturity, these types of things, and seed germination at the other end as well. Iron for chlorophyll, and then some of these other trace minerals, which sometimes don't get talked about too often, but should be talked about a lot more. Molybdenum, cobalt, and nickel. These are all essential for plant growth, and some of these are also really important for the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, as I mentioned. So moly in that instance. Cobalt also plays a role. Cobalt really important for anything legume, any of the legumes. Cobalt's really important for those rhizobia. Molybdenum also needed for nitrogen utilization, and same with nickel. I'll talk about these when we dive into nitrogen next. So nickel is an essential nutrient. It's also a heavy metal. You need to be mindful of its use. Very, very small amounts are required, but it can be also a very beneficial nutrient. We have to be. It's used for urea processing, which I'm going to talk about. So, okay, that's a 5-minute crash course in plant nutrition. We could probably spend a whole hour and go into each and all of those and kind of keep going there. But I have absolutely skimmed over that very, very quickly, I know, because I want to dive deeper into specifically nitrogen, and we're going to link in some of these other nutrients that work with nitrogen and how and why we do need to think about all of these. They are all important. I know nitrogen's our big yield driver. Of course, that's really important. You've got to pay the bills. I understand that. But there are many other nutrients on this list, and we're going to go and unpack these now, that work with nitrogen and help nitrogen do what it does. No man is an island. No nutrient, no element is an island. And this is very, very true of nitrogen. Nitrogen needs a lot of these other nutrients to work with it. And if you want to improve your efficiencies, your nitrogen use efficiencies, you've got to make sure you've got these other nutrients there working with the nitrogen. And many of those nutrients are trace elements. Now, trace elements, okay, under extreme limitations, trace elements can give very big yield responses. But very often, trace elements don't necessarily give this big yield response. We need them, they're important, but they don't necessarily drive massive gains in production unless there's extreme deficiencies. But what those trace elements do is improve the efficiency of the nitrogen utilization, of the nitrogen conversion into protein. And so that's where they can make a big impact, is helping you the nitrogen that you do use, helping you use it more effectively, use it more efficiently. So they plug in that context. That's kind of where they are still very important, helping you use the nitrogen that you use more effectively, in essence. Okay, so let's go and unpack the nitrogen discussion, because it's a big one. And I really want to drill into some details here. I'm going to get kind of quite specific in some things. We're going to go a little bit deep in some examples here, but we're going to kind of round it all off as we go. So here's kind of the what we would call nitrogen metabolism, or the metabolic pathway for nitrogen use. When the plants take up nitrogen and use nitrogen, this is kind of what they do with it. They shuttle it down various pathways with this goal, the end goal of producing these producing these organic molecules up here, like proteins, like that chlorophyll I mentioned, like the DNA. All of these things are some organic molecules that contain nitrogen. So that's really the goal. And all of these other things are really just the building blocks. The plant's scavenging these nutrients, or we apply some fertilizers, but the plant really doesn't want nitrate. It doesn't really want urea, doesn't really want ammonium. They're all just building blocks. It wants to turn them into amino acids, and especially onwards into the end goal, those more complex proteins down at the end on the right-hand side there. So this is the pathway. If the plant takes up nitrate, if we apply some UAN, for example, that nitrate doesn't just stay as nitrate. It gets converted into something called nitrite, and then onwards into ammonium. From there, that ammonium is converted into amino acids. So that's the organic molecule. And when I say organic versus inorganic, this is our inorganic nitrogen. Inorganic nitrogen, it's inorganic because it contains no carbon. It's inorganic. Carbon is the stuff of life. Anything with carbon is an organic molecule. So urea here is actually an organic form of nitrogen, an organic molecule. Of course, it's not a certified organic input fertilizer. It's still a synthetic fertilizer in that sense. But on a technicality, it is an organic molecule. It has carbon. And that's why we have urea in our urine and in our livestock's urine, etc., as part of the urea cycle. It's an organic molecule. So that's organic. It's got carbon. This is inorganic because there's no carbon. And the plant ultimately wants to stitch carbon into these and turn them into organic-based nitrogen molecules like amino acids, and then stitch a lot of those together to build these other more complex proteins. So this is the essence of the pathway in which the plant will then make use of nitrogen. Now, that pathway doesn't just miraculously happen. There are also other nutrients that are required as the enzymes or the catalysts that make this happen. And so if we expand on that, now what I've done here is put in the key nutrients that are required in order to get that nitrate along the next step of the pathway. So for example, we have molybdenum, sulfur, and iron. These three nutrients are required to turn that nitrate into ammonium, to push it along down the pathway. And if you have a deficiency of any one of those three nutrients, especially molybdenum is the key one here that's particularly important, but also the other two. If you have a deficiency of moly or iron or sulfur, that nitrate will be stuck as nitrate. It can't move down the pipe. It hasn't got the catalyst. So it's just stuck as nitrate. And so molybdenum deficient plants, as an example, molybdenum deficient plants can start to accumulate too much nitrates. And that's not a good thing. The plant does not want nitrate. It wants proteins and all of those other organic molecules down the right-hand side. So that's that idea. You've got to have the other synergistic nutrients to work with the nitrogen. Now, for urea, for the plant to make use of urea, we need nickel. Nickel is part of an enzyme called urease enzyme, and that is required to make use of urea, unlock that urea and get that nitrogen out towards pathway. Yeah. Okay. Yep. I can. Can I do that on the next slide? I'll give you a little more detail. So yeah, and the short answer is, there are all just different forms of nitrogen. There's lots of different forms, and it's really just what else is attached to that nitrogen. So nitrate has extra oxygens attached. Ammonium is also nitrogen, but it has some hydrogens attached instead. There's just different other things that come with the nitrogen. But I'll come back to your question. So nickel. So if you have a nickel deficiency, you can also have an accumulation of urea. Urea gets stuck as urea because it also can't move down the pathway. And I'm sure you've all heard of urea scorch. Now, nitrogen scorch, particularly urea scorch, in some instances can be because you just over-applied it, but it can also be a nickel deficiency because that urea got stuck as urea and couldn't move down the pathway. Now, there's another thing that causes scorch. There's two causes of scorch, actually there's a few reasons, other weather factors and things like that too, but from a nutritional point of view, scorch could be caused by an excess of urea toxicity, or an excess of toxic ammonium. And so you can see up here, when we use urea, it gets converted into ammonium. When we use nitrate, it gets converted into ammonium first and foremost, but then we need manganese and magnesium to convert that ammonium into the amino acid, into this organic form. So the other cause of scorch is excess ammonium, and that can be caused by a deficiency of manganese or magnesium. So these are the bottlenecks. If you don't have these other nutrients optimized, the nitrogen gets stuck in the wrong form. It can't move down to the more functional and useful organic molecules down on the right-hand side. And if you do a standard leaf analysis where you're measuring total nitrogen, that total nitrogen number, if it's 4% in the range of what you're looking for as an example, that does not tell you what form the nitrogen is in. It tells you the total nitrogen. And if that plant is full of nitrates, it's got high nitrates, but overall the total nitrogen is 4%, it's optimized, it's in the target range, but it's all in the wrong form. This is not the form that the plants require. And there's a really good study where they were feeding, a hydroponic study where they were feeding the plants pure urea. Sol urea was the only source, with an intentional nickel deficiency. So the plants were taking up all this urea, and they had luxury urea in them. And then when you do the plant analysis, they had ample nitrogen. It was in the target range, but the plants were expressing nitrogen deficiency symptoms in the leaves. But nitrogen was in the range, and they demonstrated that there was a backlog of urea. The nitrogen was stuck as urea. That's not what the plant wants. It's got to be down here. So for intensive purposes, the plant was functionally deficient in nitrogen, even though it had a nitrogen in the optimum zone, in the target range. Okay, so once we get, now here's the switch into the organic form of nitrogen. And when I say organic, I mean carbon attached. Inorganic, no carbon. Organic, with carbon. So now all of the amino acids, there's lots and lots of different ones. They all have carbon, and then we start to stitch those lots and lots of chains of amino acids together to build proteins, more complex and complete proteins. And there are lots of nutrients that are required for that, as you can see on the right-hand side, particularly the top three: phosphorus, magnesium, and sulfur. These three are all particularly important for good protein synthesis. And beyond that, we additionally have manganese, boron, potassium, zinc. They also play a role. Okay, because there's lots and lots of different proteins. I say proteins, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different proteins in which the plant can manufacture. So there are different enzymes, different catalysts, that are therefore different nutrients that are required to build all of those diverse array of proteins. There's lots and lots of different proteins. Okay, so that's what we're trying to optimize, and this is why you can see that it is not just about nitrogen. You've got to be managing all of these other things as well. Now, I'm not saying you have to be applying them. I'm not saying you have to be applying these other nutrients in the red boxes, but you do have to be managing them. You do have to be aware whether you have sufficient or not. And if you already have enough, then no, don't apply anymore. You've got enough. But identify where your limitations are, and then address. So let's have a quick example here. Sorry, you're obviously at the back. You're not going to see this very clearly, but I will explain. So here we have a SAP analysis. Some of you might have seen these before. This is the ones from out of the Netherlands, the SAP lab there. And I'm just going to point out a couple of things to you here, and I'll explain it for you at the back. The nitrate level on this test is very high. We have an excess of nitrates. And if we jump back here, if we have an excess of nitrates, that means that nitrate is stuck. It's a bottleneck. And so, let's have a look at our moly, sulfur, and iron on this test. So nitrates is very high. It's right up here. The bar's right up here in the excess region. So let's have a look. Here's sulfur. Sulfur is low. Iron is low. Moly is very low. So we have high nitrates and low moly, iron, and sulfur. The three key nutrients that we need to push those nitrates along. And so this is one of the value of the SAP analysis versus the traditional tissue analysis. And I'm not an anti-traditional tissue analysis. It also has my support, but we do have a little extra layer of detail that's very valuable in a SAP analysis because we're breaking apart the nitrate and the ammonium and the total nitrogen, not just giving us the total nitrogen. So with this, we can see that actually nitrates are, because here's your total nitrogen, this one here that's not highlighted, and you can see it's fine. It's in the zone, maybe a little bit high on the older leaf, but so the total nitrogen is fine, high-ish, but the reason is that the nitrate is, particularly very high there. Now I've also got boron circled here, which is also low, and that's because boron, although it's not directly involved in the nitrate reduction, there is a link there with boron deficiency. If we have a boron deficiency, that seems to reduce the activity of that enzyme or the functionality of that enzyme. So this particular example also has low boron. So the perfect, the royal flush of all of the key things that are limiting, which mean that nitrate is stuck as nitrate. So that's there's a good example of why we need to consider all of the different nutrients. Now, to your question, sir, here we have then, let's now start and break this conversation down into the different forms of nitrogen and their efficiencies, or how they're used, or the usefulness of those, and how the plant uses those from an efficiency point of view. So here we're going to start this conversation by comparing nitrate and ammonium. Now you can see over here on the right hand side we have ammonium, and when ammonium comes in, that ammonium form of nitrogen, when that comes in, it is just one step to get from ammonium into that amino acid, and the particular amino acid is called glutamine. This is the amino acid that's synthesized, and you can see it's just a one-step process. It's just a one hop skip away to get from ammonium to glutamine. Compared to nitrate, when nitrate comes in, and then to your question here, nitrate first has to be converted into something called nitrite. And then from nitrite, we have to convert that nitrite into ammonium. And then from ammonium, the final step, we convert that again into that same amino acid, glutamine. So you can see that the pathway here is much longer for nitrate. And the longer that pathway, more steps in that pathway, means that the plant is using more energy. It's draining more energy to make use of nitrates. Nitrates are the most expensive form of nitrogen for a plant to utilize, because it costs the plant a lot of energy to make use of this nutrient because of this long pathway, because of these many steps in that pathway. And to your question, what's the difference between nitrate and nitrite? So that is, it's just an oxygen. So nitrite is NO3 and nitrite is NO2. So along this pathway, what the plant is trying to do is get rid of those oxygens so that it can turn it into that ammonium, which it then it stitches in some carbon into that to build the organic molecule, the amino acid. So it's really just the difference between oxygen. Nitrate is NO3, nitrite is NO2. And the plants don't really use nitrite. It's not so, they can, like, it's part of their metabolic pathway, but it doesn't really serve a great deal of functionality for them. It's a stepping stone to get to what they really want. And that's all it is now. So the point then to start this conversation is ammonium is a more efficient form of nitrogen than nitrate, for the very simple reason that its pathway is shorter. It's a one-step process. And again, that was reflected by default back here. You can see that nitrate is further back here, ammonium is closer down the path, so it's just one step to get there, whereas nitrate has to go through these multiple steps, first from nitrate to nitrite, then to ammonium, then onwards to amino acids. Now, that does not mean that we can go and feed our plants 100% ammonium just because it's more efficient. You do still need a bit of a balance. Nitrate is negative, ammonium is positive. They need a charge kind of neutrality here, so they need a bit of both. But the take-home message here is that we want to be some nitrate in the system is quite okay, especially early on in the vegetative stages. Nitrate does play a beneficial role to encourage tillering. So if you're trying to encourage tillering, a bit of nitrate at that time is good. So, I think the practice of a bit of UAN around those early vegetative stages, encouraging a bit of tillering is good. But after that, actually nitrate is a form of nitrogen you want to use minimally. You want to steer it more towards ammonium, urea, I'm going to come back and talk more about urea, and these amino acids that we're going to expand on. So a little bit of nitrate's fine, just not too much. And in agriculture, we often use too much nitrate. There's too much nitrate in relation to the overall balance or the overall mix. We want to try and minimize that. And if you do use nitrate, you want to make sure that you've got enough, especially of moly, but also these other two. You want to make sure you've got those in-house with that nitrate so the plant can use that nitrate. Okay, so the other thing about ammonium is that it has a narrower band between sufficiency and toxicity. So it is quite easy for the plant, if we feed sole ammonium, it starts to accumulate too much and can cause toxicity. I mentioned there earlier, scorch. Both urea or ammonium in excess can cause scorch. So in practice, no, we can't 100% feed ammonium. We want a bit of a balance. But if you, much as possible, if you can steer it a bit towards the ammonium, and even better, the urea form, which I'm going to talk about, that's better. But a little bit of nitrate early on, absolutely fine. Okay, so, yeah, please.
Is this process only mediated by plants or any kind of
So the question was, is this only a plant thing, or is there other processes in the soil or amongst microbes that also facilitate this? This here I'm talking exclusively about plants. Now, in the soil, which was my great question for the timing of my next slide, in the soil, there are also these reactions that change the form of nitrogen. And yes, so microbes do this in the soil. But that whole conversation that we've just had, I'm talking about once the nitrogen is in the plant and how the plant makes use of it. So that leads us nicely into our next discussion. The classic view on nitrogen nutrition was, we focused, yes, I remembered my Z here. Here's one that I got, mineralization. I'm sure you've heard of this one, mineralization. We always talk about mineralization. We want our soil organic matter to be cycling, to be mineralizing, meaning to be releasing the inorganic form, which is first ammonium. So ammonium comes from, as organic matter, so there's some nitrogen molecules in the organic matter as well, like proteins, and they're going through these states of decay or decomposition, breaking them down into small things. And then once we get rid of all the carbon, so this is the opposite of what we were just talking about, we try and get rid of the carbon to mineralize and release back the inorganic form. Now, once we get that ammonium, yes, there are bacteria in the soil who will then convert that ammonium back into nitrates. So yes, it is also moving this way in the soils. And this was the classic view of plant nutrition. We used to believe that plants solely use inorganic forms, the ammonium, the nitrate, because they're small. These are a bit larger, more complex molecules, and we didn't think that the plants could take up these large, complex things. We thought that plants could only take up the inorganic forms. So we were encouraging this process of carbon cycling, organic matter cycling to mineralize. We're encouraging, waiting for mineralization, temperatures to warm, good soil conditions, get a bit of mineralization. Now we're releasing the inorganic form, which the plant can then take up. And yes, it'll take up some of that ammonium, and some of that ammonium in certain soil types will then be converted into nitrates by the bacteria in the soil. So then the plant will be taking up ammonium and nitrates. And that's that classic view. And we now understand that plants can use these larger organic molecules. But before we go there, what does the plant then do once it takes up ammonium, as we were just talking about on our other slide? What does the plant do with that ammonium? It doesn't want ammonium, like I mentioned. It doesn't want those inorganic forms. What does it do to that ammonium? It adds carbon. It turns it back into amino acids and then onwards into proteins. So once we support carbon breakdown and mineralization and the plant takes up that ammonium, then it does this. It expends energy to turn that ammonium back into an amino acid and then stitches those amino acids together into little things called peptides. These are small chains of amino acids, and then again more energy to build proteins. It goes backwards. And so what would happen if we just fed the plant these organic forms of nitrogen? And so I started by saying, well, ammonium is more efficient than nitrate because it's a bit further up the pathway. Well, it turns out that amino acids and organic forms are more efficient still because they're already organic. And each of these steps, this is energy. The plant's expending energy to do this. So the more of this we can save, the better. And so this is then the take-home message, is that if we can start to feed our plants some organic forms of nitrogen, and usually amino acids are the practical way we would do this, the more we can kind of get some of these into the plant, we save the plant energy and we can improve its growth through those processes. And not only saving energy, we're also changing the nutrient demand of the plant. Because if you're feeding the plant lots of aminos, or more at least, you're not going to do 100% aminos, but you just want to try and have some in the picture. If you're focused up here, well, actually, you don't need quite so much moly anymore. If you're not feeding the plant nitrate, you actually don't need so much moly. You still need some. It's still an essential nutrient. But as you lean up here, you start to change. The plant requires less of these things because you're feeding it already in the organic form. So you also change the nutrient requirements of the plant. So this is that take-home point here, is that the classic view was inorganic forms. We used to think that this was what the plants would take up. We didn't think that they could take up these complex things, organic molecules like amino acids or even complex proteins. It turns out the plant can. The plant can take these larger things in through the roots and make use of these organic molecules. So in this discussion about soil carbon cycling and encouraging mineralization, it's not that is wrong. It's not false or wrong or anything. It's just that it's half the picture. And the other half is that as carbon is cycling in the soil, actually the plants can start to take up some of these things already earlier on. We don't have to wait for mineralization. The plant can access some of these larger, more complex molecules. And we now know that plants release specific root exudates, proteases. These are enzymes that will specifically cut out organic forms of nitrogen, cut out proteins and things from the soil organic matter. Which it will then liberate those and release those from the soil organic matter to be taken up. So yes, the plants even, we now know, release root exudates to get these organic molecules of nitrogen out of the soil organic matter. And beyond that, even further, we also now know, and I'm sure some of you come across the rhizophagy cycle, we now know that even ginormous things like bacteria, relatively speaking, huge things like bacteria can also be absorbed into the plant, and the plant can use bacteria for nutrition. And that's that rhizophagy cycle where the growing tips, root tips, there's a lot of cell division, and as those cells are dividing, the bacteria get caught up in that or internalized, they get engulfed, and they become endophytes, or they enter the plant, where once inside the plant will actually send specific chemicals down to strip nutrients out of those bacterial cell walls. And I'm sure some of you have come across that. We're not going to talk about that today, but I'm just talking about as we move from the simple to more complex to even more complex, yes, we have now understand that the plants can use these organic and these biological forms, and that these are very favorable for plant nutrition from the efficiency point of view, but also very favorable from the stability point of view. Because the problem with the inorganic forms is they're a double-edged sword. They are highly, highly available, which means they can easily be taken up. But that high availability means that they are also easily lost. Nitrate will leach. Ammonium can be off-gassed as ammonia. So nitrogen is going to move up or down. Whereas if we can get it into more of these organic and biological forms, then nitrogen is just cycling. It's just going to cycle. It's not going up, it's not going down, it's staying in the root zone. And that's what these other forms have, is their stability. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's still where the jury's out, I guess I would say. Sure. Can we reduce our inputs? Absolutely, yes. There's a huge opportunity for that. Whether or not, and in natural systems and natural plants, sure, they definitely don't need any added, and I think they can meet their demands through the rhizophagy cycle, through organic cycling, etc. Once we talk about agriculture and production agriculture, where I think we have to be honest, we are pushing yields higher than what nature would do. And so there is a question mark. If you want to be maintaining those kinds of yields, I'm not sure. But, maybe a yield reduction is not necessarily a bad thing if you're also saving money on inputs and that the overall economic outcome is better. It's very easy when you put it that way, isn't it? If I gave you a choice, if you would like to increase yield or increase profitability, which one would you choose? Obviously, we all know that answer. When you put it like that, it's very obvious. So sometimes a lower yield could actually make you more profitable. I don't know why we have such a why slightly lower yields have such a bad rap. I don't know. It's about optimizing the efficiency of production and the efficiency of the economics. And sometimes that could be a bit lower. And I'm not talking like massively lower yields, but just, somewhere a bit lower there. But so in terms of production agriculture, I don't know. I think we all watch that and we're learning as we go on. Let's be honest, rhizophagy is such a newish thing. We're still very much learning about it. Yeah. And that is, and just to plug into that, that is why I'm a big fan of foliar nitrogen and foliar nutrients for this exact reason, to strike a better balance. We'll say, okay, we know that excess nutrients in the soil can be disruptive to these processes. So can we keep as much out of the soil as possible? And then that's why I think foliars have a lot of relevance. We're going to talk about them next, to try and still maintain a production goal, but keep some of those nutrients out of the soil, but just deliver them directly into the plant. Yeah. Yeah, okay. I think if you want, you'll find a lot of stuff online. There's plenty of YouTube videos from James White and things now on there. Like, he's becoming very active now, which is great. We had a discussion part of the answer there already. Definitely, you do need to reduce soil applied nutrients. And again, I'm not opposed to some. I'm not a no input guy. I am a bit of a low input guy. I think that it's very clear that we use too much fertility. There's a lot of wastage. I'm very interested in just how we can kind of trim that up and improve those efficiencies. So I'm not opposed to putting some fertility into the system and some down in the soil. It's just these huge big dollops that we put in up front all at one time. I think this is the big problem. So wherever we can try and spoon feed, and or, as I mentioned, do the foliar thing, and keep some of that excess nutrients out of the system, that would be part of the answer. And then really it's just about encouraging good, healthy soil biology. So whatever you can do to optimize that biological community, and that might be follow the soil health principles, don't disturb them, keep them covered, keep that photosynthetic carbon coming down, the root exudates, feed them. Some of those types of things is really maybe the use of organic amendments, composts, manures, compost extracts, these types of things, just to try and encourage them, some of those generalized strategies. Yeah. Okay, now I've alluded to this already, so I think you've got the message, but I just want to break it down really nice and clearly with a really nice example of this point about the efficiency of these organic forms. And I've kind of touched on this with this point about the carbon, but I just want to labor on this a little more. Here we have a really nice paper that's giving a really nice, breaking it down to why these organic forms are more efficient and some of the mechanisms of this. So I'm going to read you a few quotes here. As we go through today, I'm going to put various kind of papers like this up, and I'm just going to share the abstracts mainly. I'm just going to cherry pick a few quotes. I'm not going to go dive deep into a lot of these studies, but I do want to expose you to them to show you that you don't have to be scared of reading papers, even if you just read the abstract. And look, I know there's a lot of devil in the detail, like always. There's a lot of nuance in the paper that is important, But hey, I know you're all busy people. I know you're not going to be spending your 3 hours reading scientific papers. That's why I try and make an effort to do that and share that for you. But I'm also like to expose you to these, to just encourage you to maybe even read a bit of the abstracts. You can still glean some very useful information from the abstracts, and that's kind of what I'm going to try to do as we go through today. Okay, so this is talking about this carbon bonus, which changes the efficiency. So the chemical form of nitrogen that is taken up, whether inorganic, such as nitrate, inorganic, no carbon, or organic, such as amino acids with carbon, may significantly influence plant shoot and root growth and nitrogen use efficiencies. The key point here is that the carbon cost to the plant, the carbon cost of assimilating those organic nitrogen forms ultimately into proteins, is lower than the inorganic forms, mainly because of the carbon content that's already embedded in the organic forms. That's where the efficiency comes from, because carbon is already there. This carbon bonus makes it more beneficial for plants to take up organic instead of inorganic. Because when I say turn inorganic into organic, as I've mentioned before, that means we're going to stitch carbon into those inorganic forms to turn them into organic forms. Where does that carbon come from? Where does the plant get carbon to stitch into the nitrate or the ammonium and turn it into organic, into amino acids? Oh, you're jumping way ahead, but I like it. You're stealing my thunder here. I'm trying to build a story here. No, I'm kidding. I love where you're thinking, because you're thinking correct. Okay, let's come back to that. Any other ideas? Where does the plant get carbon from? Boom, there it is, photosynthesis. So the plant has to use photosynthetic carbon. So, sorry, yeah, the air was correct too. Yeah, you're right. The plant has to use photosynthetic carbon to stitch into the nitrate and to the ammonium. So now we are wasting photosynthetic carbon on using those inorganic forms. Now, if you deliver organic forms, then the plant is now absorbing carbon, like your questions, absorbing carbon from the soil organic matter, or absorbing carbon from some fulvics or carbon-based stimulants that we put with nitrogen. Now it is absorbing that carbon, so it can use photosynthetic carbon elsewhere, on more tillers, on filling bigger grain, bigger roots. So we are saving photosynthetic, more sugars, maybe for root exudates, to feed soil biology. We are saving photosynthetic carbon by delivering organic forms of nitrogen which already have carbon embedded. It's a beautiful thing. Okay, and here we're going to do some carbon economics and break this down. I'll read the numbers for you in case at the back you're not sure. So we're looking at, for the plant to make use of nitrate, ammonium, or two amino acids, glutamine and arginine, just two examples, we're looking at what are the carbon costs. How much carbon does it cost the plant to make use of nitrate and ammonium, etc.? And so I'll read these out, the figures out for those of you at the back. So the carbon cost, how much carbon, photosynthetic carbon, does a plant need to make use of a gram of nitrate? It needs 5.81. So 5.8 grams of carbon, photosynthetic carbon, to make use of the 1 gram of nitrate. Now, if we compare that to ammonium, ammonium is 4.3. So 5.8 versus 4.3. So this is what I was talking about before. Ammonium uses less photosynthetic carbon because it's further up that metabolic pathway. So it's more efficient because it's draining down less on carbon. Now, because they're inorganic, no carbon, there's no embedded carbon, there's no rebate, there's no carbon bonus. So the net costs remain the same. So ammonium is more efficient than nitrate. Nitrate is the most expensive form of nitrogen for the plant to use. Maybe not the most expensive for you to buy, but the most expensive for the plant to utilize. Now, if we compare that to the aminos, the organic forms, now, they're actually not too dissimilar from ammonium, 4.3 and 4.3. What that's referring to is that there is still a carbon cost for the plants to acquire the nutrients, to get them from the soil, to translocate them, to move them around. So there is still carbon cost with acquisition, with processing, with moving, etc. So there's still carbon costs associated with those organic forms as well. However, they have a rebate. So we take, there's 2.1 here, 1.9. So we take this carbon cost off the gross costs, which give us our net costs of 2.16 and 3.02. So we have 5.8, 4.3, 2.1, and 3. So you can see here the organic forms are more efficient because of this embedded carbon, and that's that essence. Now beyond this, there's also really good benefits to including a combination of inorganic with organic, and that's the practical take-home message. Yes, organic forms are more efficient and great, as we've just explained, but the cost per unit for you, the cost per unit of nitrogen is much more expensive than the cost per unit of UAN or urea or some of our synthetic forms. So it's impractical to say that I'm going to therefore go and feed 100% organic amino acids to my crop. Just the economics is not going to, you're not going to go there. So the practical outcome of this is we want to combine, marry a combination of, with our inorganic forms, we want to include some of these organic forms. And amino acids, as I mentioned, or protein hydrolysates, things like fish hydrolysates, I think are great. Good options here, or some of the amino acid based products. There's lots of them on the market now, as I'm sure you're all aware. The benefit of these is that when we apply, let's use an example of nitrate again, it could be any of these. When we apply some of these inorganic forms, let's use nitrate. When we apply nitrate, when the plant takes up that nitrate, it can detect that it's got lots of nitrate in the system. And that sends a signal to the plant to switch on the genes to code for the production of that enzyme, that nitrate reductase enzyme, that's going to make use of that. That's going to convert that along. So what I'm saying here is when the plant has a lot of the resource, it will activate the genes required to build the special catalysts, the enzymes that will make use of that form. So when we apply a lot of inorganic forms of nitrogen, we stimulate certain genes in the plant that are involved in the early stages of nitrogen utilization. We stimulate a selection of genes all down here that are required for the early stages. But as those forms move along here, as we get up here and onwards to this latter stage, there's very different genes involved in building different enzymes that are required for the late stage protein synthesis. These are very different tools that we need up here compared to the tools that we need down there. So different forms that we apply will trigger different genetic expression so that the plant will build the tools that it needs to make use of those forms. And the opportunity here, the synergy here arises when we combine inorganic with organic. Because what that does is those organic forms, that triggers all of the certain expression that's going to make use of those organic forms. If we combine that with organic at the same time, well then we also at the same time trigger this expression up here and wake up all the tools up this end. So we are priming the plant for full nitrogen metabolism. We're priming the genes along the full pathway. And to give an analogy, really what that means is that we start to kind of open the gates here. We're opening the gates, we're getting ready because we've got some of the triggers, some of the inducing expression happening. And that means that when we do that and when we open the gates, the nitrate that you apply or the ammonium that you apply, the urea, now that means the gates are open. And so we've got full genetic expression, we've got the full tools available to make use of that nitrogen all the way down the pathway. And that's exactly what it does. It stimulates then more efficient movement of our inorganic forms along the pathway down into the proteins. And so that's the opportunity, the cost-effective way to say, okay, well, I'm still going to use UAN or urea. And urea is a very favorable form. We're going to talk about that when we hit foliar discussion. Urea or UAN, and we're going to combine some amino acids with it, and then we're going to get better utilization of those inorganic inputs down the pathway. And that's the practical take-home outcome. Yeah, good question. Question was, is there a kind of an optimized ratio of organic to inorganic? No, I don't have a great answer on this. I think probably the economics is still going to be the factor that's going to dictate that. So I'm going to give some recipes as we go along here, but the thing about amino acids is that they're all quite different the way they're processed and manufactured. So you really got to follow label rates a bit here too, because some are a lot more concentrated than others. But generally, it's not. None of them is huge amounts. But no, I don't know if there's a set ratio here that optimizes this process. No. Okay, so that's our kind of, I guess, our segue into a little bit on foliars. I see it's 10:30 already. How long you want me to have a break now, or keep going? About now? Yeah, okay, because we're going to segue into. Let me do one last slide before we do that. I just want to return to this slide to say that, okay, we talk there about photosynthesis, and now I've just dived really specific into the roles of the different nutrients as enzymes that help a specific example of nitrogen metabolism. We've just kind of dived into one example, which is representing the bit more detail, but the same idea as what I was talking about here. And this is why then we need to optimize the nutrients, and there are various enzymes, catalysts that then support these various reactions. And we just did a nice case study with nitrogen. So that kind of, I just want to plug that into that. Therefore, one other way in which you can manage your plant nutrition in order to supply the key nutrients to build those enzymes is then through a foliar spray, where we can deliver these nutrients in the gold. In the yellow writing here, we can deliver those directly into the plant, especially something like nitrogen, which in the soil can be rather disruptive to soil organic matter cycling, to soil biology. And again, I'm not opposed to some. I think some nitrogen in the soil is absolutely fine. It's just dose makes the poison. Too much often is more so the problem. So that's the segue there, where we can then say, okay, well, foliars give us an opportunity to supply those nutrients to optimize plant growth and production, but maybe also align that to our longer soil health goals of kind of reducing inputs, etc. So that's where we'll steer into foliars from here. So, okay, let's get recaffeinated.
I heard you in Wichita several years ago,
Okay.
and then you were talking about putting the carbon with nitrogen.
Yes.
And then, so last year, the guy came and talked to he was from the